Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we embark on a gentle journey through time to a city of marble and dreams, ancient Rome. Picture yourself walking along the cobbled streets beneath the glow of oil lamps as the city whispers its stories to the night. Imagine the grand forums, the towering columns, and the soft murmur of voices discussing philosophy and politics. The air is cool, and the sky above is a tapestry of stars, watching over a civilization at its peak. But as we stroll through these ancient streets, we notice subtle changes. The once bustling markets are quieter, the grand halls less frequented. The empire, vast and powerful, is beginning to show signs of wear. Tonight, we won't focus on the grand battles or the foe itself, but on the quiet moments, the fading echoes of a once great empire. Let the rhythm of the story lull you into a peaceful slumber as we drift through time together. Rome, the eternal city, was not born of marble palaces nor of golden crowns. It began in simplicity, almost in obscurity. A gathering of shepherds and wanderers settled beside the slow, winding waters of the Tiber. 7 gentle hills rose from the plain, their slopes covered with wild grasses, their ridges softened by the mists of dawn. Here, in these quiet places, men and women built huts of straw and clay and lit fires that glowed warmly against the dark of the night. From those fires, a destiny flickered into being. The stories told of its beginning were not written as history, but sung as legend. Tales of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers cradled not in a palace, but in the rough embrace of wilderness. They were said to have been nursed by a she-wolf, a symbol of fierce protection, a creature of instinct and strength. When Romulus, driven by fate, founded the city upon those hills, he gave to Rome its first breath of life. The Romans cherished such tales. They were not only myths, they were mirrors of the spirit. They longed to claim a spirit of endurance, of survival against all odds, of strength carved out of hardship. And so the city grew, not in sudden grandeur, but in steady determination. The first rulers of Rome were kings, 7 in number, each leaving a mark upon the growing city. Some were warriors, forging strength with sword and spear. Others were builders, laying down stones for temples, carving channels to bring water, and marking sacred boundaries that would hold fast for centuries. Numa Pompilius, the second king, was remembered for wisdom and peace. He brought to Rome the quiet rhythms of ritual, festivals that honored the gods, laws that ordered the lives of men. Through him, discipline was woven into the heart of the people. Yet, not all kings ruled gently. Tarquinius Superbus, the proud, drove his people with arrogance and cruelty. The Romans, weary of his heavy hand, rose in defiance. They cast aside the rule of kings and, with courage that seemed almost reckless, they built instead a new order, The Republic. The Republic was unlike anything the world had seen. It was not the power of one, but of many. Two consuls, chosen by the people, guided Rome year by year. The Senate, a council of elders, held memory and wisdom. Assemblies of citizens gave their voice, and in this careful balance of powers, Rome discovered strength. It was a fragile system, yet it endured because the Romans believed that their duty to the Republic was greater than the desires of any single man. Honor was their currency. Discipline was their bond. And above all, they revered the mos maiorum, the customs of their ancestors, the old ways that gave them identity and purpose. But the world around Rome was restless. Neighboring tribes pressed close. The Sabines, strong and proud, tested Rome's resolve. The Etruscans, rich in art and ceremony, challenged her with their kings and armies. Yet Rome did not falter. Through war and alliance, through patience and cunning, she grew stronger. Each victory, no matter how small, bound the citizens more tightly together. Each loss, no matter how painful, taught them endurance. When the Gauls swept down from the north, wild and fearsome, they captured Rome itself. The temples burned, the streets lay in ruin, and the people trembled. Yet even then, Rome did not perish. From the ashes, she rose once more, rebuilding her walls, rebuilding her spirit, learning the bitter lesson that no defense is greater than courage. And so she turned her eyes outward. Italy itself became her stage. Bit by bit, Rome extended her hand, sometimes in friendship, sometimes in conquest, but always she drew others into her orbit. The Latins were given treaties, the Etruscans were granted partial citizenship, the Allies were bound by promises of land and protection. Rome's genius was not only in the sword, but in the way she transformed enemies into partners. Through this web of loyalty, Italy became Rome's heartland, its people united by shared duty to the Republic. But beyond Italy lay challenges far greater. Across the sea rose Carthage, wealthy, ancient, a city of merchants and sailors. Her ships ruled the waves, her merchants grew rich on trade. The clash between Rome and Carthage was inevitable. The Punic Wars, as Gibbon describes, were long and terrible. Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, marched with elephants across the Alps, a feat so daring it seemed touched by myth. He descended upon Italy like a storm, defeating legion after legion. At Cannae, the Roman army was crushed, the fields stained with the blood of tens of thousands. Yet Rome endured. She endured with a patience that bewildered her enemies. She refused to surrender, refused even to negotiate. Year by year, she gathered her strength, and at last, under Scipio Africanus, she carried the war into Africa. At Zama, Rome triumphed, and Carthage, once so mighty, was broken. From that moment, Rome's destiny expanded beyond the horizon. She was no longer merely a power of Italy. She was the mistress of the Mediterranean. Greece fell beneath her influence. Its philosophers and poets carried into Roman homes. Macedonia, Asia Minor, Spain, all became part of her dominion. Her roads stretched outward like veins of stone. Her aqueducts carried water like silver streams. Her legions marched with a rhythm that seemed as eternal as time itself. Yet, as Gibbon so gently warns, within triumph lay the seeds of decline. Wealth poured into Rome, not only gold and silver, but luxuries, silks, spices, slaves. The simple farmer soldier, once the backbone of the Republic, gave way to generals who commanded vast armies and sought power for themselves. The Senate quarreled, the assembly swayed with bribes, and the balance of the Republic grew fragile. But in this telling, let us pause upon the rise and not yet the fall. For in her ascent, Rome was dazzling. She built cities that glittered with marble. She established laws that gave order where chaos had reigned. She brought distant peoples into a common story, a story of discipline, of ambition, of a vision larger than any single life. And so, as you drift toward rest, imagine the Rome of her beginnings, the soft glow of firelight upon the Tiber's banks, the hum of voices in the forum, the steady march of sandals upon stone roads, the proud egos of the legions glittering in the sun, a city rising, ever rising, toward a destiny it could scarcely yet imagine. Rome, the eternal city, climbed slowly from village to empire, from myth to power, from fragility to strength. And in that rise, there is a rhythm as calming as the tide, a reminder that even from the smallest beginnings, greatness may grow stone by stone, step by step, until the world itself takes notice. And as you rest now, you may let that rhythm carry you. The rhythm of a people enduring, the rhythm of a city ascending, the rhythm of Rome, ever rising, ever enduring, ever eternal. The Republic, once a fragile experiment upon the banks of the Tiber, had secured its foundation in Italy. But to endure, to flourish, Rome could not remain small. The world around her was restless, filled with tribes and kingdoms, each vying for power, each holding lands Rome desired. And so, steadily, cautiously, and at times with breathtaking boldness, Rome began to expand. First came the conquest of Italy. The peninsula, with its mountains, valleys, and coasts, was home to many peoples. The Etruscans in the north, the Samnites in the rugged central highlands, the Greeks who dotted the southern shores with shining colonies, and countless tribes whose names are now almost lost in the mists of history. Rome stood among them, not yet supreme, but rising with determination. The wars were long and often brutal. Against the Etruscans, Rome learned the weight of strategy and alliance. Their cities were rich, their armies disciplined, Yet one by one, they were subdued. The Samnites, fierce and unyielding, tested Rome with battles fought in mountain passes where every step was hard-won. The struggle stretched for decades, a rhythm of advance and setback, of victory celebrated and defeats endured. But Rome did not tire. Her citizens returned again and again to the field, driven not by the glory of one man, but by the collective will of the Republic. Slowly, the map of Italy changed. Rome's influence spread like ripples upon still water, outward, ever outward, until most of the peninsula was tied to her, either by conquest, by treaty, or by alliance. The genius of Rome was not only in her legions, but in her policies. Those who submitted were often rewarded. Citizenship, in part or in full, was extended to conquered peoples. Allies were given protection, a share in the Roman story. Thus, what began as resistance often transformed into loyalty. By the 3rd century before Christ, Rome had bound Italy into a unity, an unshakable foundation from which she could launch her ambitions farther still. But across the sea, in the shining city of Carthage, a rival awaited. Carthage was wealthy beyond measure, its harbors filled with ships, its coffers heavy with the profits of trade. From Spain to North Africa, its influence was vast. The two powers, Rome and Carthage, stood like twin giants upon the stage of the Mediterranean. Their clash would decide the destiny of the known world. The Punic Wars, as history would remember them, unfolded across generations. The first of these wars began as a dispute over Sicily, that fertile island lying like a jewel in the sea. Rome, still new to naval warfare, built fleets from nothing, teaching her soldiers to fight upon the waves as if they marched upon land. After long years of struggle, Carthage yielded Sicily, and Rome tasted her first dominion beyond Italy. But it was the Second Punic War that carved itself deepest into memory. From Carthage rose Hannibal, a commander whose daring seemed almost divine. With elephants and men, he crossed the icy Alps, a feat so astonishing that it still stirs wonder today. He descended upon Italy like a thunderstorm. At Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, at Cannae, he shattered Roman armies. Tens of thousands lay fallen. For a moment, it seemed as though Rome herself might be undone. Yet Rome did not break. Her strength was patience, unyielding resolve. Even in defeat, the Republic refused to surrender. New legions were raised, new strategies devised. Year by year, Rome regained her footing. While Hannibal ravaged Italy, Roman generals struck at Carthaginian holdings in Spain, chipping away at the empire that sustained him. At last, under Scipio Africanus, Rome carried the war to Africa itself. At the Battle of Zama, the fate of Carthage was sealed. Hannibal was defeated and Carthage humbled. She was stripped of her power, bound by treaties, reduced from rival to dependent. Rome had triumphed. but triumph carried her still farther. The Third Punic War, decades later, was less a war than a final act of destruction. Carthage, though weakened, still stirred unease in Roman hearts, and so the city was besieged, its walls torn down, its people sold into slavery. Carthage was no more. Rome stood unchallenged in the Western Mediterranean. From there, the Republic's gaze turned east. Greece, with its philosophers, its poets, its proud city-states, lay divided, weakened by centuries of conflict. Macedonia, once the realm of Alexander's heirs, still held some measure of power, but even that could not resist Rome's steady hand. Rome did not only conquer Greece, she absorbed her. The libraries, the art, the learning of Athens all found their way into Roman culture. Conquest became exchange. Where Rome brought order and discipline, Greece gave philosophy, sculpture, and a vision of beauty. The two civilizations, though unequal in power, merged into something larger than either alone. By the 1st century before Christ, Rome's dominion stretched vast across the Mediterranean world. Spain lay under her command, North Africa bowed to her will, Greece and Asia Minor fell into her orbit. The republic that had once fought merely for survival in Italy now ruled lands from the Atlantic to the Aegean. But such expansion carried a price. The wealth of empire flooded into Rome, bringing riches and luxuries, but also corruption and unrest. The farmer soldiers, who had once been the sturdy heart of the Republic, were displaced by estates worked by slaves. Generals commanded armies that were loyal to them rather than to the Senate. Ambition burned hotter, and the balance of the Republic wavered. Civil wars erupted. Marius and Sulla, Pompey and Caesar, each struggling for supremacy. The Republic, so carefully balanced, teetered under the weight of empire, and in that struggle, a new figure rose. Augustus, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, the master of a war-torn state. With quiet patience, with calculated power, he reshaped Rome itself. The Republic, in truth, was gone. In its place stood the empire. Augustus called himself Princeps, the first among equals, but in reality, he held the reins of power. Under him, Rome knew peace, a peace so deep and lasting that poets named it the Pax Romana. The frontiers were secured, roads and cities flourished, trade bound together the far corners of the Mediterranean. Rome had entered a new age, an age of stability, an age of empire. Here, at the dawn of empire, Rome's story pauses, not in decline, but in the glow of triumph. From shepherd huts on 7 hills, from battles with Sabines and Samnites, from ashes left by the Gauls, Rome had risen through Italy, through Carthage, through Greece to stand as mistress of the known world. Under Augustus, the Republic gave way to empire. Yet, the transformation was gentle, almost imperceptible, like the slow turning of night into dawn. The forms of the old Republic remained: the Senate, still met, the magistrates still wore their robes, the assemblies still gathered. But behind these ancient masks, the true power rested in one man's hands. Augustus was patient, deliberate, and above all cautious. He remembered the fate of Julius Caesar, cut down by daggers in the Senate, and he chose instead the path of subtlety. He called himself Princeps, the first among equals, and spoke always of restoring the Republic. Yet the soldiers swore loyalty to him, the provinces answered to him, and the Senate obeyed his will. The Republic lived only in memory. The empire had begun, and yet, under Augustus, Rome flourished. The chaos of civil war faded into order. The frontiers were guarded, the legions carefully stationed along the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates. The heart of Italy was at peace, its fields fertile, its cities prosperous. The roads stretched outward like veins, carrying soldiers, merchants, and ideas to the farthest edges of the known world. It was an age of building. In Rome itself, temples rose in shining marble, forums spread wide with colonnades, theaters echoed with voices and song. Augustus, modest in words but grand in vision, boasted that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. And indeed, the eternal city began to glitter, its stones catching the golden light of the Mediterranean sun. The poets sang of this new peace. Virgil told of Rome's destiny. Horace praised the quiet joys of country life. Ovid celebrated love and beauty. The arts, nourished by stability, flourished in every form, and across the provinces, Rome's presence was felt not only in her legions, but in her laws, her language, and her way of life. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was not merely the absence of war, but a harmony imposed by power, a rhythm of order that stretched from the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Gaul, from the shores of Spain to the plains of Asia Minor. For generations, this peace endured like a long, steady breath. After Augustus came emperors of varying temper, some wise, some cruel, some indifferent, some ambitious. Yet through it all, the structure he built held fast. The legions kept their watch, the provinces paid their taxes, and the empire continued to grow. By the 2nd century, Rome stood at her peak. Under the rule of Trajan, the empire reached its widest extent. Trajan was a soldier, disciplined and determined. He led his armies across the Danube into the rugged lands of Dacia, where mountains bristled with fortresses and warriors resisted fiercely. Yet, Roman persistence prevailed. Dacia was conquered, its wealth poured into Rome, and Trajan's column still rises in the city today, telling in carved stone the story of his victories. But Trajan did not stop there. He turned eastward toward the great empire of Parthia. His legions marched into Mesopotamia, seizing cities, crossing rivers, pushing the boundaries farther than ever before. For a brief moment, Rome stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east, from the misty highlands of Britain to the sands of the Sahara. It was an empire of unimaginable breadth in a world within itself. And yet, even at this height, the limits of power began to show. The farther the legions marched, the thinner their strength became. Distant conquests were hard to hold, harder still to govern. Though Trajan dreamed of further expansion, death came before he could realize it. His successor, Hadrian, chose a different path. Where Trajan had sought conquest, Hadrian sought consolidation. He traveled ceaselessly across the empire, not to conquer, but to strengthen. In Britain, he built his famous wall, a line of stone and earth, marking the empire's northernmost frontier, separating Rome from the wild lands beyond. Across the provinces, he inspected legions, reformed laws, and left behind cities adorned with temples and theaters. He sought not endless conquest, but enduring stability. Hadrian loved the arts, the philosophy of Greece, the beauty of architecture. He built the Pantheon anew, its grey dome opening to the heavens, a wonder of engineering and grace. He adorned Athens with splendid works, honoring the culture Rome had once conquered, but never ceased to admire. Under his rule, the empire glittered not only with power, but with learning and beauty. By the time of Hadrian, Rome had accepted the truth that her boundaries could not expand forever. Instead, she embraced the strength of defense, securing her frontiers, preserving the vast dominion already won. And for a time, this balance held. From the Tiber's gentle waters, from the shepherds' huts on 7 hills, Rome had risen to command the world. Through conquest and alliance, through the Punic Wars and the absorption of Greece, through the transformation of republic into empire, she had become a power so vast that her name was spoken with awe from one horizon to the other. Her legions, disciplined and unyielding, guarded the edges of her world. Her roads stretched like veins of stone, binding together peoples of many tongues and lands. Her cities glittered with marble, her forums hummed with debate, her theaters echoed with laughter and applause. And above it all, the emperors, first Augustus, then Trajan, then Hadrian, guided the great machine of empire, each in his own way. Rome, at her peak, was not only a power of armies, but a maker of order. Her laws gave structure, her culture spread widely, her very presence brought stability. For centuries, this peace endured so long that generations lived and died, knowing only the security of Rome. And so, as you drift into rest, you may picture the empire at its height, the legions marching steadily along the Danube, the ships sailing calm waters of the Mediterranean, the marble temples gleaming beneath the sun, the walls of Hadrian rising against the northern wind. A world united under Rome, vast, enduring, held together by discipline and vision. This was Rome in her fullness, her greatness, realized her empire stretched to its farthest edges. It was a moment of triumph, a summit reached, a height from which, in time, the long path of decline would begin. But for now, in this gentle pause of history, Rome stands eternal, a dream of order and power, glittering across the ages, wrapped in the quiet glow of her greatest age. Rome, at her peak, seemed eternal. Her roads stretched unbroken from ocean to desert. Her legions stood vigilant at every frontier. Her cities glittered with marble and bronze. To those who lived beneath her rule, it must have seemed impossible that such grandeur could ever fade. And yet, even as Rome basked in triumph, the first shadows lengthened quietly across her horizon. For within the very strength of empire, seeds of weakness had been sown, and though they lay hidden for a time, they would one day take root and grow into cracks that not even Rome's might could mend. The vastness of her dominion was both glory and burden. From the windswept highlands of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Arabia, Rome's reach was immense, but to govern such distance was a task beyond human hands. Messengers rode for days. Orders crossed mountains and seas, and by the time word arrived, circumstances had already changed. Decisions lagged, responses faltered, and the machinery of empire, once so efficient, strained under its own size. Corruption crept in, softly at first, like ivy upon old stone. Senators, once guardians of the Republic, sought not duty, but profit. Governors of provinces drained their subjects with harsh taxation, their coffers swelling, while the people grew restless under the weight. The old Roman ideal of service, of sacrifice for the state, gave way to ambition, to self-interest, to the quiet erosion of trust. The economy too began to groan. The wealth of conquest had once filled Rome's granaries, its treasuries heavy with spoils. But as expansion slowed, so too did the flow of riches. Taxes grew heavier. Farmers, driven from their lands, sank into poverty, while vast estates were worked by slaves. The balance that had once sustained Rome, citizen soldiers tilling their fields, then marching to war when called, was broken. The soil of Italy itself lay neglected, its spirit drained, its people restless. And yet, to the casual eye, Rome still gleamed. The forum still bustled. The amphitheater still roared with games. The legion still marched with banners held high. But beneath that glitter, the foundation weakened. The virtues of old, discipline, simplicity, loyalty, faded, replaced by hunger for luxury. The citizens of Rome, once hardened by toil and duty, grew accustomed to spectacle, to comfort, to the steady grain dole that filled their bellies, while their spirit dimmed. The old bond between citizen and state loosened. Once, every man saw Rome as his own, his honor tied to her survival. Now, many looked not to sacrifice, but to pleasure. The empire provided bread, the empire provided games, and so the people gave little in return. This was not the collapse of a single day, nor even a single century. It was a slow softening, the quiet fading of steel into dust. The military, too, began to change. In earlier days, the legions had been drawn from Rome's citizens, men who farmed in peace and fought in war, bound by duty to their homeland. But as generations passed, this spirit weakened. Citizens grew reluctant to leave their homes, their fields, their comforts. Recruitment faltered, and so Rome turned outward, drawing soldiers from the provinces, even hiring mercenaries, men who fought for coin rather than loyalty. Such armies could fight bravely, yet their allegiance was fragile. They served the general who paid them, not the state itself. And so, loyalty shifted slowly, dangerously, from Rome to individual commanders. When those commanders sought power, their soldiers followed them not as citizens, but as clients. Thus the sword of Rome became a tool of ambition, turned as often against fellow Romans as against foreign foes. Along the borders, pressure mounted. The Germanic tribes, restless beyond the Rhine and Danube, pressed more boldly against the frontiers. They did not yet have the strength to overwhelm Rome's walls and legions, but their presence was constant, a whisper of danger at the edges of empire. To the east, a new power stirred in Persia. The Sassanid dynasty rose with vigor, reviving the might of ancient kings, challenging Rome with armies disciplined and fierce. For centuries, Rome had faced Parthia as an equal rival. Now, with the Sassanids, the threat grew sharper still. And as these pressures gathered, the throne of Rome itself became unsteady. The age of the good emperors, from Augustus to Hadrian, had given stability. But after Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, came Commodus, vain, careless, and unworthy of the burden he carried. From his reign onward, the empire slid into instability. Emperors rose and fell in swift succession. Some were assassinated, others overthrown by their own soldiers. The throne, once a seat of strength, became a perilous prize passed from hand to hand with alarming speed. Civil wars flared, armies clashed, not only against Rome's enemies, but against each other. The empire's strength, so long united, was turned inward upon itself, and through it all, the people watched. Some still clung to the old virtues, still tilled their fields, still bore their duty with pride, but many more drifted into dependence. The grand festivals grew louder, the spectacles more lavish, while true strength slipped quietly away. Thus, Rome entered a new age, an age not yet of collapse, but of slow unraveling. Externally mighty, internally weakened. Like a vast tree, its branches broad and green, but its roots slowly rotting beneath the soil. As the torches still lit Rome's grand avenues, as her amphitheaters still echoed with cheers, the first quiet fractures spread unseen, and though the empire still shone with the brilliance of marble and power, its decline had begun softly, silently, like the coming of night. The cracks that had begun so quietly spread further with each passing generation. Rome, still vast and still proud, was no longer the Rome of discipline and unity. Her strength remained formidable, yet within, her spirit grew weary. The economy, once fed by conquest, now struggled to sustain its endless demands. Gold and silver, once flowing from the spoils of war, slowed to a trickle. Taxes grew heavier, pressing down upon farmers and merchants alike. Many could no longer bear the burden. They abandoned their lands, slipping into poverty, or seeking refuge under the protection of wealthy landowners. Thus, the free citizenry dwindled while inequality deepened. Slave labor, once the foundation of Rome's prosperity, became a curse. For slaves could toil, but they could not innovate. Fields lay overworked, mills ran without care, and productivity declined. The land, like the people, grew tired beneath the weight of empire. In the cities, luxury flourished for a few, while hardship spread among the many. The old virtues of simplicity and restraint gave way to extravagance. Banquets stretched long into the night, lavish feasts and entertainments distracting from the emptiness beneath. Meanwhile, in the provinces, villagers bore the strain of taxation, their people resentful, their loyalty fading. The military, once the iron heart of Rome, struggled as well. Recruitment faltered. Fewer citizens sought the discipline of the legions. Instead, Rome turned ever more to mercenaries, foreign soldiers drawn by coin. They fought bravely at times, but their loyalty was fragile. When coin failed, allegiance faltered, and often these mercenaries brought with them the very tribes pressing upon Rome's borders. The Germanic peoples along the Rhine and Danube pressed closer, their raids testing the empire's strength. The Goths, emerging from the northern forests, watched Rome with hungry eyes. The Vandals stirred, restless, along the frontiers. To the east, the Sassanid kings of Persia challenged Rome with fire and sword. Their armies bold, their ambition fierce. For the first time in centuries, Rome faced true rivals who matched her in determination. And as these pressures mounted, the throne itself grew ever more unstable. The 3rd century became a time of turmoil, an age historians would later call the crisis of the empire. Emperors rose and fell in quick succession. Some reigned only for months, others for days. Assassination became common, a dagger in the night, a betrayal among supposed friends. Generals, raised to power by their soldiers, marched on Rome itself, each claiming the purple. Civil wars burned across the provinces, not in defense of Rome, but in contests for its crown. The throne, once the pinnacle of honor, had become a perilous prize, a burden few could carry for long, and each change of ruler weakened the state further, draining its strength, dividing its loyalty, casting shadows of doubt over the empire's endurance. Through this chaos, the provinces suffered. In Gaul, in Spain, in the eastern lands, local rulers sometimes broke away, forming short-lived empires of their own. Though Rome eventually reclaimed them, each fracture revealed the fragility beneath the surface of power. The frontiers too grew fragile. Barbarian raids grew bolder, slipping past defenses, plundering towns, leaving fire and ruin in their wake. The Rhine and Danube, long the shield of Rome, trembled under constant assault. The East, too, wavered. The Sassanids captured cities, threatened Syria, and for a time even seized the emperor himself, a humiliation unthinkable in earlier days. And yet, even in this turmoil, Rome endured, for she was vast, her resources still immense, her people resilient. Reforms came, sometimes harsh, sometimes desperate. Emperors strengthened the army, fortified the frontiers, and tried to restore order. The empire survived, but it no longer shone with the easy confidence of her golden age. The contrast was stark. In the heart of Rome, the grand avenues were still lit by torches at night. The Colosseum still thundered with games. The baths still steamed with warmth. The temple still gleamed beneath the sun. To many, daily life continued unchanged. But to the careful eye, the difference was clear. The empire's surface glittered, yet beneath, the shadows deepened. The decline was not a sudden fall, but a slow transformation, a fading of the old spirit, a weakening of the bonds that once held Rome together. Duty gave way to self-interest, discipline to indulgence, unity to division. What had once been Rome's greatest strength, her people's devotion to the state, was quietly slipping away. Still, even as these shadows lengthened, Rome seemed eternal to those who lived within her. The amphitheaters roared, the markets bustled, the legions marched, and so the story of decline was not one of collapse alone, but of paradox. An empire outwardly strong, yet inwardly fragile. The philosopher might reflect, as Edward Gibbon once did, that the period of greatest strength was also the beginning of greatest weakness. For empires, like men, carry within themselves the seeds of their own undoing. The wealth that once sustained Rome made her soft. The conquests that once strengthened her overstretched her grasp. The peace she gave her people dulled their spirit. And so, as Rome appeared most secure, she was, in truth, most vulnerable. Thus, as night fell upon her avenues, as lamps glowed softly in her marble halls, as fountains murmured in her gardens, the shadows of decline deepened. The whispers of barbarian tribes beyond the frontiers, the stirrings of Persian kings in the east, the rivalries of generals within, all pressed closer. And though the empire still stood vast, still glittered with grandeur, its strength was no longer what it had been. Like a mighty tree, its canopy still broad and green, but its roots hollowing beneath, Rome stood at the edge of a long twilight. The torches still lit the grand avenues of the eternal city. Children still laughed in her courtyards, merchants still called in her markets, and priests still tended her shrines. Yet, beyond those shining walls, storms gathered, and within, the old virtues of Rome had dimmed to embers. Thus, quietly, almost invisibly, the decline had begun. The decline, once a whisper, grew louder with each passing century. The empire, so vast and magnificent, stood now at the edge of storm. Her walls still gleamed, her legions still marched, but the pressures within and without pressed harder than before. One of the greatest changes came with the division of empire. The realm had grown too large, too unwieldy for one ruler to govern, and so, in the late 3rd century, the emperors chose to divide the West, with its heart in Rome and later Ravenna, and the East, with its jewel in Constantinople. The East was wealthier, its cities stronger, its trade routes rich. The West, though proud, was poorer, its frontiers more exposed. Thus began the slow shift of power, the center of gravity moving eastward, while the West staggered under its burdens. The frontiers, once secure, now trembled under waves of new peoples. The Goths, pressed by hunger and by the advance of the Huns, moved southward toward Roman land. They came not only as raiders, but as whole nations, families, elders, children seeking refuge within the empire. Rome, long used to ruling others, struggled to absorb so many at once. At first, Rome tried to manage them, offering land in exchange for loyalty. But mistreatment and mistrust sparked conflict, and so came the fateful day at Adrianople in the year 378, when the Roman army, once the terror of the world, was shattered by Gothic warriors. The Emperor Valens himself fell upon that field. The defeat shook Rome's confidence, for never before had barbarian arms so utterly crushed the legions. From that moment, the Western Empire wavered. More tribes pressed in. The Vandals, the Suebi, the Burgundians, each seeking land, each carving pieces from the empire's edge. The Huns too thundered forth from the steppes, their horsemen swift, their arrows deadly. Led by Attila, they swept across Europe, a storm of fear and fire. Even Rome trembled at their approach, though in time the Huns faded as swiftly as they had risen. Yet the wounds they left remained. For every incursion, every settlement of tribes within Roman lands weakened the empire further. The western provinces, once rich and ordered, grew fractured. Gaul, Spain, Africa, all slipped from control, falling to new kingdoms born upon Roman soil. Amidst this storm, the emperors of the West were shadows of their predecessors. Some ruled for months, others for years, but few with strength enough to endure. Real power often lay not with emperors, but with generals, with courtiers, with the shifting tide of intrigue. The throne of Rome, once a seat of majesty, had become fragile, a prize fought over in the fading light of empire. And yet, even in this twilight, Rome endured with surprising resilience. She had faced disaster before. She had risen from sack and ruin. And so, though weakened, she still stood. Her people still walked the marble streets. Her markets still bustled. Her walls still guarded the eternal city. But the world beyond was changing, and Rome's place within it grew ever smaller. The East, in Constantinople, remained strong, a beacon of wealth and culture, its walls rising proud against all foes. But the West, battered and weary, could not match its vigor. Thus the balance tipped, and the Western Empire drifted closer to its final hour. The 5th century dawned, and with it came storms more fierce than any before. In the year 410, a moment unthinkable arrived. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, entered Rome itself for the first time in 8 centuries. The eternal city was taken by foreign hands. Though the sack was brief, though the city survived, the shock was immeasurable. Rome, once invincible, was revealed as vulnerable. The empire staggered on. Generals like Aetius, the last of the Romans, fought valiantly to hold the crumbling frontiers. He defeated Attila the Hun, halting the storm upon the plains of Gaul. But such victories were fleeting. Each battle won could not mend the deeper wounds within the empire. The Vandals crossed into Africa, seizing the fertile lands that once fed Rome. From Carthage, they launched ships upon the sea, raiding coasts, threatening Italy itself. In 455, they too entered Rome, their sack more thorough, their plunder more complete. The eternal city wept again. The Western Empire, bereft of resources, bereft of unity, grew weaker still. Provinces slipped away like sand between fingers. Spain, Gaul, Africa, each lost to new kingdoms that rose upon the bones of empire. By the late 5th century, the emperor in Rome was emperor in name only. Real power lay with generals, with kings of barbarian peoples, who carved realms within the empire's lands. And so, in the year 476, when the last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odoacer, there was little resistance, little surprise. The title of emperor, so long a symbol of majesty, passed quietly into history. The Western Roman Empire was no more. The eternal city, though still standing, was no longer the heart of a world-spanning dominion. Instead, new kingdoms rose in the West. The Goths, the Franks, the Vandals, each taking their place in the unfolding story of Europe. And yet, even as the West fell, Rome did not vanish. Her laws, her roads, Her language, her memory endured. In the East, in Constantinople, the empire lived on, a beacon for 1,000 years more. And throughout the ages, the shadow of Rome lingered, a memory of grandeur, a dream of unity, a reminder that even in decline, her spirit could not be erased. The fall of Rome, though tragic, was not a single moment, but a long twilight. Generations lived and died within its fading light, some unaware of the great change unfolding. For decline is often quiet, like dusk descending, until only in hindsight does the night seem sudden. Thus ended the Western Empire, its story complete, its grandeur faded, its glory remembered. And now, as the story of Rome settles into silence, so too may you. The torches along her avenues are dimmed. The marble temples lie quiet beneath the stars. The voices of senators and soldiers, of poets and emperors, fade gently into memory. The eternal city rests, and so may you. Let the echoes of her story become soft whispers in your dreams. Let the weight of centuries drift away as you sink deeper into calm, into quiet, into rest. For though empires may rise and fall, the night holds you gently, eternal in its peace. Sleep now in the stillness of history's embrace.